hoaxy. And yet in the church, we talk about this grace, and we talk about in a level that it's free, that it's not something that we can create, that a human person, I mean, we can't merit it, we can't purchase it. And if we're not careful, whenever we try to overemphasize that in hopes that someone would accept it and receive it, there carries with it a side effect. And that is because we talk often about how grace is free. If we're not careful, we can talk about it in terms that it's really cheap, because it's not something that we can do, so maybe we don't fully understand the cost, that it actually is something of great value, and that it's offered without anything in return. Which makes me wonder how often we might take the grace of God and all of its goodness for granted and just assume that it's ours, sometimes even entitled to it, unmerited favor, because God just gives that freely. And yet, when we do this, and when we expect grace to be given freely without recognizing the cost, we actually block its full impact in our lives. Which, if you've read the Old Testament, this is the central problem in the Old Testament. I know some of you are studying the book of Amos with me, and Amos, this is crystal clear in the whole book of Amos. Amos was a prophet to the northern kingdom. He lived about 20 miles outside of Jerusalem, and he's about 20 miles from what we would probably call the Mason-Dixon line. And he traveled north into the northern kingdom that were the 10 tribes of the north. And they were ruled at that time by a king by the name of Jeroboam II. And from the outside looking in, by all outward appearances, Jeroboam II, successful, very accomplished in military battle. He was able to actually increase the borders of the northern kingdom. He won a number of wars with some of the surrounding people in his day, and in doing so, he amassed a great level of wealth. So at that time, under Jeroboam II, the northern kingdom, as a country, very wealthy. And they went to church all the time. They had 2 temples, one in Bethel, one in the extreme north of the northern kingdom, and under the tribe of Dan. And they would go and worship for them was sacrifices. And they would sacrifice bull after bull after bull after bull after bull all the time. Every time that there was a major festival, they all attended. And yet Amos said, from the outside, everything looks really, really nice. But on the inside, no transformation. So spiritually, they were poor. Because they expected, to use this New Testament word, this grace of God, to be given freely to them regardless. And there's something about a sense of entitlement, it's a spiritual entitlement, that blocks our ability not only to receive grace in its fullness, but to actually stop its work inside the life, our life, and how it seeks to transform us from the inside out. When I was at SMU for a period of time studying under a guy by the name of Billy Abraham, and one of the just sheer blessings in my life was to be able to listen to one of what I would probably call, if not the greatest preacher, at least one of the top 3 preachers of the last century, a guy by the name of Hayden Robinson. And if you ever get a chance just to Google up his sermons, just one of them, it is well worth your time. And I remember a story when I was out in Texas that he was preaching to a congregation, and he told this story about a time in Russia under the time of the czars. And there was this young lieutenant who was on the backside of Russia, an outpost, just this military outpost, and he was in charge of that outpost. And just under boredom of living in that day and that time, so far away from Moscow, so far away from other larger cities, he began to gamble all over the place. And whenever he would come up on the wrong end of that, he would borrow from the outpost treasury. And he did it over and over and over again. And as long as he could either cook the books or maybe hopefully for a lucky bet to sort of right the trade, he felt like everything would be okay until he got wind that the Tsar and some of the Tsar's lieutenants were coming to evaluate the post. And so one night before they were supposed to be there, he opened up the safe and he took out the books and he began to make the additions, and he realized that he was so far in debt, it was well beyond a lifetime of income. So he didn't know what to do. So he began to drink, and he drank himself to sleep. But just before he did, on the ledger he wrote, "So great a debt, who can pay?" And part of what the Tsar would do in that day is he would dress as a commoner, and he would make his way into the office, and he would look at the books and give an evaluation before the real evaluation. He wanted to get a bird's eye view up front. And the moment he walked into the office, he recognized the young man because it was one of the closest allies of the Tsar. It was his oldest son. And then he looked down on the ledger, and he saw where the young lieutenant wrote those words, "So great a debt, who can pay?" He knew exactly what was happening. And so he reached in his pocket and he took out his official ring, and he dipped it in the wax, and he put the signet of the ring on the ledger, and then he signed his name. That's that level of grace. So great a debt, who can pay? And there's something about that level of goodness that is overwhelming in one breath. And then because we try to make it easy for people, and we talk about how free it is, if we're not careful, we just assume that it should be this way. And although grace is something that God freely gives, it's definitely not something that we deserve. And it definitely comes with such a great price. Which brings me to the Isaiah passage. Not every passage in the book of Isaiah is messianic, but there are some. And this is one. Now there's another messianic passage that we would probably rather read, and we read this often at Advent during Christmas, where it talks about Jesus as a wonderful counselor and a mighty God and a Prince of Peace and an everlasting Father. And just the image and the ring of that, we would read over and over and over again. But this passage is the flip side of this, where Isaiah talks about the cost of grace, a cost that God bears on our behalf. Verse 4, "Surely he has borne our grief, carried our sorrows. He was pierced for our transgressions, and the Lord laid upon him all the iniquities of us all." So if we want to talk about Isaiah's passage in terms of sin, shame, brokenness, depravity, it does not matter what term we place upon it. It is the same. So great a debt, who can pay? And yet, this unmerited favor, this level of hesed, this level of forgiveness, given freely. But it does come with a cost, even if that's something we can't pay. And when we consider the weight of it all, the cost, the value of this grace, when we were able to hold this to whatever levels that we can, actually what that creates in each one of us, spiritual maturity. Maturity is the ability to hold the true value of things just as they are. I mean, it doesn't matter if we talk about it in terms of spiritual maturity or emotional or relational, it's still the same. I mean, have you ever think about the person that you would say is the most mature person in your life? They just hold the value of things. And just as they are. They don't keep them at arm's length. They don't run from them. They just receive them just as they are. And it normally follows, after that, humility and gratitude, which strikes at the heart of entitlement. Spiritual entitlement. And being able to hold on one hand how wonderful and free the grace of God is, meaning it's not something we can merit. And then to hold the value of it. That produces humility and gratitude, which was not lost on Jesus. In that Matthew passage, Jesus he's entering into the sunset part of his life. Now, you need to know something about the synoptics. The synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they follow the same pattern. And for about half to maybe 2/3 of the gospel, it's 3 years. But they slow down that last week of Jesus' life, and it takes forever. And there's a reason why. The writers, the gospel writers, want you to focus in on exactly what Jesus is doing during that last week. And he's getting ready to move into that last week in Matthew's gospel, in our passage. And so he's directly preparing his disciples to get ready for what it's going to be like when they move to Jerusalem. And he begins to teach them that says, we're going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to be arrested and I'm going to be tried. And eventually I'm going to endure a cross. And then finally a resurrection. And immediately there's protest. Peter, no way, no how. Did you catch Jesus' response to Peter? You're a hindrance to me. You're a hindrance to my grace that will lead to transformation, not just for you, but for the world. See, when we embrace this level of this from the Old Testament, this spiritual entitlement, it leads us to a grace without a sacrifice, comfort without a cost. And yet Jesus taught us that the road to grace is also a road for him to suffering. And when we hold the value of it, and just to receive it to the best of our ability as it is, and allow that work of grace to begin from the inside out, a level of transformation. It's not that what came after that teaching is something that we have to do. It's something we want to do. If anyone would come after me, let him or her deny himself or herself. Let them take up their cross and follow. Not because it is a burden, it is a privilege. Because of the level of grace. If you're my disciple, you receive my grace, and you walk in the same steps as I walked, even if that requires a life of sacrifice. But when we feel entitled to this, we will look for the shortcuts, the loopholes, and the easier path. But when we hold the grace of God in its fullness, we gladly take up a cross and we follow. So great a debt, who can pay? And what does it profit a person to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? See, the real problem whenever we live with this level of entitlement is that it blinds us to the beauty and the depths of God's grace. And sometimes we even go so far as to think we deserve it. And we fail to see the magnitude of what was actually given. And we fail to understand that the cross was a sacrifice that cost God everything for our benefit. That's unmerited favor. That's Hesed. That's the fullness of what the New Testament talks about in forgiveness. So we still have a few days left of Lent. And Lent is about soul searching. Lent is about looking into the mirror and asking the hard questions. And one of them is, what do we really think of God's grace? And maybe could we even go so far as to hold it for what it is and to allow it to work inside of us, where we actually hold and value the magnitude of it all. If someone were to ask you to define the grace of God, how are you going to answer? It is free in the sense of it doesn't cost you anything, but it costs God everything. And that's the value of His love. Oh God, as we, again, in these deliberate steps, as we set our gaze towards the cross and then the resurrection, it's easy for us to go right to the end game. That makes us feel good, and rightly so. And yet sometimes in doing so, we miss the very deliberate and direct steps that you took for that resurrection. And so slow us down. Remind us again. Break into our time and space for us to hold to the best of our ability to see again that you bore our grief and our sorrows, that you were pierced for our transgressions, and that the iniquity of all of us was laid upon Him. Oh God, help us to see the true value of that gift of love. And we pray this in your name. Amen. Our hymn of consecration, you'll find it's hymn number 420. Breathe on me, breath of God. I want to invite you to stand as you're able as we sing this together. Hymn 420. I invite you to receive this choral benediction.